A government jet sits on the runway in Pretoria, fueled, polished, and ready. The pilots have their order. The flight plan is clear. Take off, cross the ocean, land in Washington, and perform a familiar ritual that the world has watched for years. At the end of every G20 presidency, the outgoing host flies to the next one to hand over the baton of leadership. It is a ceremony of continuity, a way of saying, we recognize your stage as the center of the world. But this time, something different happens. The engines stay quiet. The jet does not move. The seat reserved for South Africa at the handover ceremony remains empty. While cameras in Washington wait for a smiling photo with a South African leader, the message from Pretoria is simple and unyielding. If you want the G20 presidency, you will respect us where we stand. We will not fly across the world just to bow to tradition that benefits you more than us. At the very same moment, if you look at a different map, you will see something else. Dozens of American military facilities spread like pins across the African continent. Bases, drone hubs, logistics centers, power projecting inward, watching, listening. One plane refuses to fly. Dozens of flags remain planted. My question to you tonight is this: is South Africa's quiet no just a small diplomatic disagreement? Or is it the first open page in a new chapter where Africa finally says, enough? We are not your students. We are not your backyard. We are your equals. Because in the next few minutes, I want to take you behind the speeches and the headlines, to a place where strategy documents are written, summits are skipped, and contempt is sometimes hidden inside very polite words. And when you see that, you will understand why a single plane that never left the runway could keep some very powerful people awake at night. Let us begin with what everyone saw. The official story is simple. South Africa completes its term as G20 president. The next host is the United States. Tradition says the outgoing host travels to the incoming one, smiles for the cameras, shakes hands, and passes the symbolic baton. It is a photo opportunity, a show of unity, a signal that everyone is happily playing on the same field. For years, every country has followed this script. No one wanted to be the one to break it. But this time, South Africa calmly wrote a different line. Pretoria informed Washington that it would not be sending a high-level delegation just to perform a symbolic handover on American soil. The presidency of the G20, South Africa said, belongs to the group, not to a stage managed in one capital. If the United States wanted a ceremony, it could attend the summit in Johannesburg, where the baton would pass in full view of all. There would be no pilgrimage to Washington, no ritual of deference. On television in Europe and North America, commentators called it a protocol issue, a scheduling disagreement, a minor misunderstanding. The language was soft, almost sleepy, but in African homes, the mood was very different. On radio call-in shows from Lagos to Nairobi, people were saying, at last. At last, one African country had declined to play the role of the visiting pupil, flying across an ocean to stand in someone else's spotlight. In the United States, many viewers over 50 barely noticed the change. A retired man in Ohio, watching the evening news, hears a brief line. The United States did not attend the G20 summit in Johannesburg this year. His first thought is simple. We have enough problems at home. Who cares? For decades, Americans have been told that their country will always be at the center of global gatherings. The idea that a summit in Africa might matter enough to show up for. That still feels strange, but in Johannesburg, in the conference halls and hotel lobbies, the absence was loud. No president, no vice president, no senior representative. A chair left empty not by accident, but by decision. For years, African leaders have flown long distances to attend meetings in Washington, New York, London, Brussels. They go because they are told it is important, because investment and aid and military cooperation depend on being seen in the right rooms. This time, when it was Africa's turn to host the world, one of the most powerful nations chose not to come. On social media, a young South African woman posted, "When they invite us, we must arrive on time. When we invite them, they can stay home. That is not partnership." A radio host in Accra put it even more sharply. "If they can skip our summit without apology, maybe we can skip their ceremonies without guilt." To many African citizens, South Africa's refusal to make that handover trip was more than a scheduling choice. It was a quiet but unmistakable message. We are not extras in your production. We are not props to decorate your stage. Africa is a stage of its own. This is why the handover ritual matters. On paper, it is just a ceremony. In reality, it is a symbol of who must travel to whom, who is assumed to be the center, and who is expected to orbit around it. When a small country flies to a great power to hand over leadership, the message is subtle but clear. Your soil is the main stage, ours is the side room. By declining, South Africa rewrote that script. It said, "If you want the baton, you can receive it where we stand, under the same roof as everyone else." Now here is the question that hangs in the air like a drumbeat. If this were truly just a tiny break from protocol, why did Washington respond by not showing up at all in Johannesburg? Why was there not even a senior envoy to sit in that chair, smile for the cameras, and say, "We remain committed partners"? Was the calendar really that full? Or is there something deeper, an unease with a continent that is beginning to speak in its own voice, on its own soil, without asking for permission? In a few minutes, I want to read you the kind of language that appears in American strategic documents about Africa. Words that describe us not as friends, but as territory in a contest. If you do not want to miss that, if you want to be able to return to this conversation and share it with someone you love, make sure you stay with me and keep this channel close. Because what is at stake here is not one summit. It is the way an entire continent is seen. Before we talk about maps and bases, we must talk about respect, or more precisely, respect that comes with conditions. In recent years, you have heard many speeches from American presidents and secretaries of state standing at podiums and saying, "We see Africa as a partner of the future. We value African leadership. We want a relationship of equals." The words are smooth, the applause is polite, but contrast those speeches with the behavior. When African nations vote with Washington at the United Nations, open their markets on Western terms, sign on to security arrangements designed abroad, they are praised as responsible stakeholders. When they step off that line, by choosing different partners, by refusing a deal, by questioning a base or a policy, suddenly the tone changes. Concerns are raised about stability, about democratic backsliding, about problematic partners. Respect, it seems, is available, but only for those who play within the chalk lines that someone else drew. Former President Donald Trump made this dynamic easier to see because he often spoke without the usual layers of diplomatic sugar. He questioned whether South Africa was fit to lead, used language about the African continent that many found openly insulting, and spoke about recolonization in ways that opened old wounds. You may remember some of those moments. They were shocking not because they invented disrespect, but because they stripped away the polite mask that usually covers it. Across Africa, people asked a simple question. If an American leader can speak this way in public, what is being said in private? If this is the tone when cameras are rolling, what is the mindset when they are not? Let me explain something very plainly to my American friends who are over 50 and watching this. For decades, your government has described its presence in Africa as a mix of generosity and security, aid, development, training, partnership. And there is some truth in that. There has been help, There has been cooperation. But in internal strategy papers, Africa is also labeled as something else, a theater of strategic competition, a place where the main concern is not African welfare, but preventing rival powers from gaining influence. Imagine a world where, on the stage, someone hugs you and calls you brother. Then, backstage, they point at you on a map and say, "We must make sure no one else gets too close to this piece of land." That is what respect with conditions looks like. When a European ally disagrees with Washington on trade or security, there are harsh words, yes, but also negotiations, second chances, careful efforts to preserve the relationship. When an African country disagrees, there are often threats, spoken and unspoken, about aid reductions, security cooperation, or investment. The message is, you do not have the same room to argue as others. You are still on probation. So let us ask the question, if a country is only treated as an equal when it obeys, is it truly respected? If South Africa must fly across the world to perform a ritual, but the United States can skip a summit in Johannesburg without apology, is that partnership, or is it a habit of hierarchy? Inside South Africa, the reaction to this standoff was complex. In the townships, in the suburbs, in the mines. People argued in shops and on buses. Some were proud. "At least this time we did not run," they said. "At least this time we did not bend." Others were afraid. If they cut trade, if they move investments, if they punish us quietly, will we pay the price? In a mining town, a man named Thabo finishes a night shift deep underground. Emerging with dust on his face and aching shoulder, he works in a mine that produces the platinum and other minerals that flow into the technology and cars of the wealthiest countries on Earth. When he hears that his government refused to travel to Washington for a ceremony, he smiles a tired smile. "We dig up what everybody needs," he says, "but our pay still barely covers the basics. If this is our way of saying we're tired of just getting crumbs, I'm glad. But I also know, when you say no to rich people, they don't forget. They find ways to remind you who they think is in charge." Across the rest of the continent, reactions echoed through radios and phones. In Burkina Faso and Mali, where new governments have pushed back against old security arrangements and asked foreign forces to leave, South Africa's decision was seen as confirmation that they were not al-Sig'ai. "The South is finally speaking like the West," someone joked. "We in West Africa started saying no. Now the South is joining the choir." In East Africa, the mood was more divided. Some leaders worried about losing Western approval and the investment that follows. Young people, however, were often thrilled. "If they can do it, maybe we can too." A university student in Nairobi wrote online, "Maybe we don't always have to nod and smile." In the think tanks of Washington and Brussels, analysts began to write papers with anxious titles. "Has the West lost Africa? How to compete with BRICS in the global South." They looked at the growing trade between African nations and Asia, the expansion of BRICS to include more African members, the talk of new payment systems that bypass traditional Western channels. Suddenly, the empty chair in Johannesburg and the idle jet in Pretoria looked less like small protocol issues and more like symbols of a deeper shift. To understand this shift, you must listen not only to presidents and ministers, but also to ordinary Africans. Many of them are tired of being insulted in one moment and courted in the next, tired of being told that they are partners in public and pawns in private. They do not want to be dominated by any power, Western or as Eastern. They want to be treated as equals by all. They want what every nation wants, the right to choose their own path, even if the journey is hard. The question that follows is sharp. How does Washington truly see Africa? as a collection of voices that can say yes or no, or as a piece of ground in a larger contest. And what do all those American flags on African soil really mean? Let us now look at that other map, the one I mentioned at the beginning. Imagine spreading a large map of Africa on your table. Now take a pen and mark each place where American troops, planes, or intelligence facilities are regularly stationed. Dots on the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, along key coasts and choke points. Some are large bases, others are so-called lily pads, small, flexible outposts. Together they form an invisible web of presence. Officially, these bases and facilities exist to combat terrorism, protect shipping lanes, and support allies. Those are real concerns. And I do not deny that some threats are real, but presence is power. When a foreign military can watch your skies, move through your territory, and act quickly on your soil, it has more than just a protective role. It has leverage. It has a vote, often a veto, over what you can and cannot do. Somewhere in a government office in Washington, there is an unclassified summary of strategy that describes Africa not as a community of nations, but as a critical theater where America must maintain access, secure supply chains, and counter the influence of rival powers. If you read those lines carefully, you will notice something. The central subjects are American interests, our access, our supplies, our competition. African lives, African democracy, African dignity appear as supporting actors, not as the main characters. Now combine that mindset with the map of bases and the empty chair at Johannesburg. Ask yourself, if you are the leader of a country that hosts foreign troops, depends on foreign loans, and relies on foreign markets, how free are you to say no when you truly want to? How often will you soften your words, adjust your policies, delay your decisions for fear of losing support or facing pressure? When Washington chose not to attend the Johannesburg summit, was it just a matter of scheduling? Or was it also a way of saying, we do not need your stage, our planes still fly over your land, our bases still stand on your soil. You can have your symbolism, we still have our presence. And here is the cliff hanging before us. If Africa remains a continent where the air is watched by someone else's drones, the seas are patrolled under someone else's terms, and the big decisions are taken elsewhere, what does sovereignty truly mean? Is it a flag and an anthem, or is it the power to refuse without fear? Stay with me. Because now we must widen the lens from South Africa and the United States to a broader picture, where countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and others are beginning to rearrange the board. Only then will you see why a single canceled ceremony can be part of something much larger. Across the Sahel region, countries that once depended heavily on Western military support began to question the results. After years of operations, terrorism remained. Instability persisted, and local populations felt humiliated by raids, checkpoints, and decisions made far away. When some of these nations told foreign troops to leave and sought new arrangements, they were warned of chaos and collapse. Yet they decided that living under permanent protection that did not protect them was its own form of collapse. In parallel, blocs like BRICS expanded, offering African countries new avenues for investment, trade, and political coordination. These new options are not perfect, and they come with their own risks, but they break one illusion: the idea that the West is the only game in town. In economics, new development banks and new trade routes began to form. In politics, African leaders started using phrases like non-alignment, multipolarity, and strategic autonomy with more confidence. Of course, many in Washington and European capitals responded with a familiar argument, one I have heard my whole life: you poor countries cannot afford this kind of pride. You do not have huge armies. You do not control global currencies. If you say no to us, you will destroy your chances. You should be grateful for what you receive. To my friends watching in America, I want to speak to you gently but honestly. This argument sounds reasonable only if you ignore some key facts. For decades, Africa has supplied the minerals that run your phones, your computers, your electric cars. Cobalt, lithium, platinum, rare earth elements, many of them come from African soil. Africa also holds one of the youngest populations on Earth, a future workforce and market that companies around the world are eager to reach. And Africa sits across critical shipping lanes that connect continents. These are not weaknesses, they are sources of leverage. If your electric future depends on materials that come from the ground beneath my people's feet, who is truly in the weaker position? If your companies count on selling goods to our rising middle class, who needs whom? When we are divided, our strength is scattered. When we act together politely but firmly, the balance begins to shift. Respectfully, I say this: pride without planning is suicide. It is not enough to shout slogans and burn flags. But planning without dignity is slavery. It is not enough to have perfect macroeconomic charts if your policies are written to please foreign creditors more than your own citizens. Real sovereignty requires both careful strategy and unshakable self-respect. In recent years, some African nations have tried to combine those two things. They have revised unfair contracts, diversified their partnerships, and invested in regional cooperation. They have said no to certain offers, not because they hate the West, but because they love their own people more than they fear disapproval. They have endured pressure, bad press, and predictions of doom. And yet, slowly, something is changing. People on the street begin to feel that decisions are being made for them, not just about them. But leverage on paper does not automatically turn into real strength. It must be exercised. It must be defended. That requires leaders who can stand up and citizens who will stand with them. So the question becomes, from Johannesburg to Ouagadougou, from Lagos to Nairobi, who is willing to build a future on their own feet instead of living forever under someone else's umbrella? To answer that, we need to look at a word that has been used for generations but rarely lived in full unity. Africa has 54 countries, dozens of currencies, hundreds of languages, and a map drawn by outsiders who often put borders where rivers, families, and trade routes once flowed freely. This diversity is a gift, but it has also been a weapon used against us. When one country says, "We will not sell at that price," a buyer simply turns to the neighbor. When one government says, "We will not host your base," another quietly raises its hand and offers land. Disunity has been our weakness. Foreign powers have understood this very well. It allows them to negotiate one-on-one, to play us against each other, to secure cheap resources and favorable terms. When we compete against each other for the same investors, the same deals, we drive down our own value. Imagine a different Africa, one where countries coordinate their positions on key minerals, set minimum standards for contracts, and agree that if one of them is publicly disrespected, others will speak up. Unity does not mean sameness, it means cooperation. It means that when one African nation says, "We will not bow," others do not kneel behind its back for a small reward. We must also talk about solutions that are not just slogans. On the economic front, African nations can work together to add value to their resources before exporting them. Refining, processing, manufacturing. A continent that exports raw ores and imports finished batteries will always be trapped. A continent that learns to build its own factories, even slowly, begins to write its own future on security, regional forces can gradually take on responsibilities that foreign troops now hold. This is not quick, and it is not cheap. Training, equipment, coordination, all of it takes time. But every step toward a situation where African soldiers answer first to African parliaments, not foreign commands, is a step toward real freedom. On the political level, unity can mean that when a summit is held in Addis Ababa, Johannesburg, or Abuja, attendance is not treated as optional by the world's powerful. It means we insist that global gatherings rotate fairly, and that when it is our turn, others come to our soil as readily as we have gone to theirs. Let me introduce you to another face in this story. Her name is Amina. She is in her 30s, living in Lagos, and she runs a small technology company that helps businesses in West and Central Africa move goods, pay each other, and cross borders with fewer obstacles. Her clients come from Ghana, Senegal, Cameroon, and beyond. She spends less time thinking about visas to Europe and more time thinking about internet reliability, cross-border payments, and customs rules inside Africa. When asked about South Africa's decision and the skipped Johannesburg summit, she shrugs and says, "I don't need a visa to America to know I have value. I need a stable connection, clear laws, and a continent that doesn't see itself as lower than anyone." For her, unity is not just a dream, it is a practical necessity. Without smoother African cooperation, her business cannot grow. Without a continent that believes in itself, her ambitions will always be limited by someone else's ceiling. There are already small victories that tell us what is possible. Trade corridors that allow farmers to sell their produce to neighboring countries without routing it through distant ports. Regional payment systems that reduce reliance on foreign currencies. Cooperative projects in energy and infrastructure that link African states together. These may not make big headlines abroad, but they build a foundation on which independence can stand. For Africa internally, every such step changes psychology. Citizens begin to see that saying no to unfair deals does not automatically mean ruin. It can mean the beginning of something better, something built slowly but more securely. For other regions in the global south, Latin America, parts of Asia, these moves are watched closely. If they can renegotiate, if they can diversify, if they can insist on respect, people think, perhaps we can too. For the wider world, this is a challenge. A world in which Africa is unified, confident, and organized is a world where old habits of dominance become harder to maintain. You cannot simply dictate terms to a continent that knows its worth and is willing to walk away from the table when treated as less. So let me ask you this. If today South Africa can decline a ceremonial trip, if yesterday Burkina Faso could decline a foreign base, if tomorrow Nigeria or another giant decides to decline an unfair oil contract, what happens the day after when a whole continent decides it will no longer take its place at the back of any line? In the months ahead, there will be more summits, more communiques, more photo opportunities. There will be BRICS meetings discussing new members and new currencies. There will be African Union sessions debating reform. There will be negotiations about foreign military presence, about digital infrastructure, about who builds and controls the next generation of networks and supply chains. These will not all take place in Washington or Brussels. Increasingly, the crucial gatherings will be in African capitals, on African terms. For Africa, the deepest meaning of South Africa's stand is this: every no has a cost, but every no also breaks another link in the chain. Saying, "We will not fly just to please you," will not magically fix unemployment or inequality, but it resets the conversation. It forces others to realize that the days of automatic obedience are over. For the United States and the West, there is a lesson too. Respect cannot be just a word in a speech. It cannot mean, "We will call you partners as long as you vote our way, host our bases, buy our goods, and accept our terms." If you truly believe in equality, you must accept that sometimes your partners will disagree, choose different allies, or refuse symbolic acts that once boosted your image. You must be willing to sit in their cities, under their flags, listening to their priorities, not just expecting them to come to you. For the world as a whole, the shift we are witnessing is the slow, uneven birth of a more multipolar order. It will be noisier, it will be less predictable, it will involve arguments and mistakes and new kinds of tension, but it may also be more just. A world where no single capital can assume that others will always come when called is a world where dignity has a better chance of surviving. Nam Phi từ chối một chuyến bay. Burkina Faso từ chối một căn cứ. Những quyết định này không phải là những cơn bốc đồng, chúng là những bước nhỏ trong một hành trình dài, hướng tới câu nói đơn giản. Chúng tôi là chủ nhà trên đất của mình. So, I leave you with this. The next time you hear that a summit was skipped, or a ceremony was altered, or a deal was declined, do not shrug and say, just politics. Ask instead, whose dignity was being defended, whose independence was being quietly asserted, and whose pride was being challenged. In our next conversation, we will go even deeper. We will take one of those military or economic agreements, the kind that brings foreign troops or foreign control onto African soil, and we will walk through it line by line. You will see, in the clauses and the footnotes, how a nation can lose more than it gains, simply by signing on the dotted line. If your heart beats a little faster when you see a small nation stand tall in front of a great power, do not let this be just another video you scroll past. Share this message with someone in America, someone in Africa, someone in the wider global South. Subscribe and stay close, because this story is not finished. Africa bows to no one, and if you believe that, then let your voice, your choices, and your courage say it with me, so loudly that no summit, no ceremony, and no empty chair can ever ignore it again.